Video link. Let's go to it. Hello, bruvs. Looks like we're finally set up here. No one's here.
Hello, bruvs.
Look at that. We got an echo.
Finally set up here.
No one's here.
Hello, bruvs.
Turn that off. We are set up. Set up to win, bruv. Gallery of ghost stories. What other books can I grab, bruv? Holy shit. James Reynolds is an awesome and strikingly original assemblage of authentic stories of ghostly manifestations. Ghosts, as is well known, are remarkable in many ways. One of their more intriguing characteristics is a curious reluctance to leave their familiar haunts. They show almost no inclination for travel abroad. Hey, I'm fucking dead. I'm going to travel abroad. Although such experiences would give them obvious educational advantages. But no, they continue to walk through the same echoing halls, along the same dimly lighted corridors, up and down the same creaking stairways, moaning, groaning, clanking chains, or dripping blood year after year, century after century. A few have been known to emigrate, but such ghosts were usually fictional creations. The real ghost prefers to stay close to the scene of original horror. Thus, a problem arises. Where genuine apparitions are involved, the ambitious ghost hunter is obliged to go to them, to seek out his quarry in the native habitat. Fortunately, James Reynolds had both the means and the leisure for travel. His lifelong interest in authentic supernatural events drew him to many lands, near and far. His journeys spanned all the continents on Earth, brought him to modern cities and to half-forgotten hamlets, to great castles and to ancient ruins. By profession, Reynolds was an artist illustrator. His reputation was international. His works were exhibited in the leading galleries of Europe and America. Yet his interest in things supernatural, an interest first aroused in childhood by his grandmother's ghostly tales, lured him away from his work. The vaguest hint of old grisly horrors, a whispered legend of spectral beings, inexplicable manifestations in ruins or houses, these seemed to rouse his curiosity. Art then took a secondary place in his life, and he turned to the chase. He delved into musty old records, queried the old folks in the region, visited the haunts of the specter. Meticulously, tirelessly, he gathered all the information available to a human being, put it together, wrote the story down, and often sketched the scene of the haunted place. This, then, is his book of authentic ghost stories. Here are the expert's choice, selected from hundreds of the best tales of England, France, Italy, Portugal, Norway, India, the United States, and other countries. It is not a book for the squeamish, and even the bravest are advised to read it in broad daylight. Well, I randomly picked up a rather short one. And it's going to be The House That Trembled in Fear, Waterford, Vermont, 1880. The figure of a brooding woman standing still as death. Sighting. Motoring. Oh, The House That Trembled in Fear. Motoring the St. Johnsbury from Waterford one day in midsummer a few years ago, I saw a road leading off the main highway, a sort of lane, not very wide, not a particularly handsome prospect. What caught and spiked my interest were the immensely old and wildly gnarled apple trees that seemed to cover the steep hillside, skirting one side of the road. It was a typical backcountry New England road. Anyone who has seen my paintings of Ireland or Virginia will know that I am enormously fond of old dade tree, not a speck of life in it. As I heard a faintly contemptuous Negro say one day in Virginia when I was filling a sketchbook with magnificently gnarled old black and white sycamores, quickly drawn in, I fill my sketchbooks with this kind of tree, old dade or not. So this day in Vermont, I stopped the car halfway up the hill and prepared to sketch. Why I looked suddenly toward a small grove of maples and elms, I don't know, but I did. Standing half hidden in the cross-hatcheted shade was a house, sadly in need of paint. If indeed it had ever known a lick of paint, grayish-white, silvered by time and changing seasons. What rooted me to the spot on the slope where I stood up till then precariously, was the fact that the house was trembling, shaking in every timber, and not a breath of air was stirring anywhere on the hillside. There was no sound of rending beams. The doors and the solid wooden shutters, some closed, others open, did not sag. The house just stood there on its brick foundation, trembling in fear. Sounds like some butter churning bullshit. For at least 5 minutes, the house trembled as if in a small class of earthquake. A long time to watch a strange occurrence like this, not having the remotest idea what it was all about. As I turned toward the car, I saw the woman standing still as the figure of death is supposed to stand. Then I shivered. But she was not looking at me. She was regarding the trembling house intently, bitterly, vengefully, just as she had done since the night she was driven out of that house 40 years ago, as I learned later. I watched the woman, who was dressed in what seemed to be a kind of dark gray mackintosh, or it might have been the garment called a wrapper. On her head she wore a small dark shawl, pushed far back. Her eyes burned in their deep sockets. They were angry eyes. Then she stepped back into the sky, or seemed to. She did not walk anywhere. I walked up the slope to the house to see if anyone within had seen this little charade and to ask what it meant. The house was deserted and had been for a long time, I gathered. When I reached St. Johnsbury, I made some inquiries. No one I asked seemed to know anything about such a house. One man, the local printer, said, lots of lonesome houses in the back hills. People come from off somewhere down valley or up mountain, build a house, try to farm. All sorts of crazy things happen. Land ain't no good, they brood. A few days later, I went again to Waterford. It occurred to me that a man who had been postmaster for years, but was confined to a small house these days with rheumatism, could tell me what I desperately wanted to know. For the cavern-eyed woman who carried hate in her dilated nostrils, baleful as an army with banners, really haunted me. I sought the man out. For the sake of narrative, I shall call him Job or Job Trotter. I struck pay dirt with a vengeance. I couldn't have come to a better chronicler. Job Trotter had the affairs of the township at his tongue's end, going back 60 years on his own, and 3 times that by the well-known. My grandfather told my father, Root, and he was keen to tell me. It is quite a story. The Greeks had a word for this kind of hate. One's doom, they called it. There is truly no escaping it. Sweet in the nostrils lurked the musk and amber in revenge. Job Trotter accepted with a courteous bow my proffered pouch of pipe tobacco, proceeded almost to rock himself off the porch, and riddled me this. As you've probably noticed, Job said, the house was no great shakes, just a plain two-story clapboard house with a long lean-to for storing winter logs, hundreds just like it in Vermont. I was a young man taking girls to the spelling bees when it was built, must have been 50 years ago. I remember old man Scheller, who built it to rent, had a hard time getting back brick hauled up the hill. Everybody used stone anyhow. A man named Farr, Jake Farr, from up Woodstock way, rented it. Then he went away, stayed a month or more, came back with a wife, stranger to these parts. Never liked her, that Sally Farr. No reason. She stayed on her hill, raised currants, apples, made bed quilts. Farr was shiftless, but they raised a fine daughter, Molly. All the boys liked her, and, bad to tell it, Jake liked her too. What? Was Jake the father? Anyway. When Molly was 16, he got her in trouble. Sheriff took him to St. Johnsbury jail. What did the lying fellow do but say Molly wasn't his daughter? So it was his daughter. Said Sally had taken up with some peddler, kind that makes the rounds of lonely farms in the spring and late summer. Sometimes they stay the night. Not that that makes any difference. Don't take long to do it. Well, Job went on, the country people hereabouts were divided. Not that Jake was much liked, but the woman was against Sally Farr. But the women were against Sally Farr. Too handsome, I always thought. All right for those that like dark gypsy hair and eyes. Anyhow, the sheriff got a jury to let Jake go free. Better for him if they hadn't. When he got home, Sally was there, just as always. She'd sent Molly to an institution in Massachusetts where a girl learns a trade. Got her away from Jake, anyhow. The baby'd come and died. Providence stepped in there. From a neighbor who used to live on the hill 1/2 mile from the Farrs, I heard that the moment Jake set foot in the house, Sally never spoke a word to him again. Not even when he drove her out with a shotgun one night. Seems like Jake just couldn't stand the everlasting silence and the black looks from those gypsy eyes of Sally's. She cooked for him, washed his clothes, raised her fruit, made her quilts, same as always. But for 12 years, she rode that man to perdition by the worst nagging a man can get, silent hate, and always with him. One night, the neighbor's house burned to the ground. A high wind, no water. You know how it is in the back country. Sally took the neighbor in for a few days. She told later she was never so glad in her life as to get shut of that house. Fear was in every clapboard, even she felt it. Jake was wasting away to a shadow because he couldn't eat. Afraid every dish of food Sally put on the table in front of him was poisoned. Seemed she started leaving little notes around the house so Jake would find them. Just scraps, like of this, said Job, tearing off a corner of newspaper. Get arsenic for currant bugs, and told me how to give it to him in oatmeal. Wait for cold morning, is what they'd say. How would a man feel shut up with a hating woman at her mercy? Well, Jake couldn't stand it any longer. One evening, the neighbor who was over scratching around in the ruins of her cellar for some potatoes that had escaped the fire heard a hot time going on at Jake Farr's. He was hollering so loud she couldn't hear him 1/2 mile. She could hear him 1/2 mile away. When she came up in front of the house, there stood Jake, hair and clothes all which way. Of course he'd been drinking. The neighbor said he held the gun in his hands, but he was shaking so with fury or fear, both I bet, that he couldn't have hit the broadside of a barn. He was yelling, "She tried to poison me. Tried it before. I'll kill her if she ever comes through this door again." The neighbor walked on into town, Waterford hair, but she said she didn't blame Jake for trembling in fear, for going every day of his life in fear, because there stood Sally across the road looking hate and danger into him, fit to kill. That night, Sally looked around a bit, but couldn't find her nowhere. Some said she'd gone to join Molly. She hadn't. Funny little things began to happen at Jake's place. One night, all the currant bushes were ruined, cut off at the roots. Then his dog was poisoned. Only friend he had. He looked terrible these days. all bones and drinking heavy, scared to death kind of look. Then one night he was sitting reading the paper. A shot came through the window and bored a hole clean through the part he was reading. So he said, so he said, so he said. Then he knew it was Sally because she was a sure shot for a woman. He told Ace Fordham he'd go to get out of that house. Why? He said every crack sound every time a branch touched the window pane, he jumped out of his skin. He told Ace the house itself seemed to shake with fear, never knowing what would come, when, nor where from. About this time, what do you think happened? Molly heard her pa was near the end of his tether. She forgave him and came back one Sunday to see him. The neighbor who went up to the house with her said he cried like a baby. Just as Molly was leaving that night, saying goodbye to Jake, his jaw dropped. Molly followed his eyes. There stood Sally Farr in an old Macintosh, holding a gun across their belly. Jake ran into the house and got his gun. When he got back there was no sign of Sally. Why Jake didn't leave that haunted house then and there, don't ask me, for it was haunted. Haunted by an old fear. Fear lived with it day and night. Fear that seeped into the very shingles of the roof. But he was gunning for Sally now, just like she was gunning for him. Of course, he heard all about it in the village. You know villagers. Job asked me. No, guess you don't. Not a squeak they don't hear. Then one day a boy from the village had been out gathering pine cones for his camp down by the river. Pine cones make great fires, you know. It was just before sundown. Boy was crossing the orchard. Heard a man shout. It was Jake Farr standing in the doorway of the house. He raised the gun he was holding at rest and fired across the gully. The boy turned to see just as another shot rang out. It came from across the gully. There stood a woman. The boy didn't remember Sally, but he described her right enough. Her shot hit its mark, drilled Jake Farr clean through his windpipe. Good shot. The boy couldn't get down to the post office quick enough. I was postmaster then. We got together a sort of posse. When we found Jake in a pool of blood on his own doorstep, we found a funny thing too, a scrap of paper. In pencil was written, "Arsenic's too slow." At Jake's head were 2 crossed sticks. I heard gypsies make that sign at a crossroads. A sharp point tells which way they went. No sharp point at all on those sticks. Nobody ever saw nor heard of Sally Farr again. Only as a ghost. Yes, lots of people passing on the hill road say they see her just standing quiet, eyes burning, looking. People tell me that just driving along the road to St. Johnsburg, Jesus Christ, in a car in the winter, that is, when the leaves are off the trees, you can see the Farr house shaking from cellar to roof, just like Jake Farr shook with fear. I saw it too once in the moonlight. Creepy thing. What happened to Molly, I asked. Molly? Oh, she worked as hired help in Burlington. Died years ago. Never did hear any more of Sally after she shot Jake. I'm sure that if the people, whoever they are, who tell of seeing the Farr house trembling in the moonlight or in the light of a winter day, could see across the gully to a spot on the side of the orchard that is hidden from the main road at all times, Sally Farr would be standing there just as I saw her. Vengeance written large on her staring face. Cold, implacable Sally Farr. She got her man. Well, goddamn, she did. Goddamn if she didn't. Well, that was a wonderful story. Young man afraid of a smile, boy. Old crown in the deserted palace of amber. Pages of this bullshit. .184. It's like 7 pages. A lot of reading, boy. Old Clown. What's it called? Old Clown. Old Clown in the Deserted Palace of Amber. Here we go. This seems fucking creepy enough. Old Clown in the Deserted Palace of Amber, Rajputana, India, 1775. Ruin traps the old clown. Desolation binds him. Old Clown in the Deserted Palace of Amber. Crouching like some senile old tiger, teeth forever gone in decay, watching through half-closed eyes the heavy tread of passing years, the deserted palace of Amber drowses on a hilltop above the newer town of Jaipur, guarding memories of its days of greatness and splendor, of living seldom equaled anywhere, anytime. The hurrying life of today, with its noisy inventions for incredible speed, lopping off mile upon mile of land and ocean, scarcely I can't fucking read. Scarcely flutters a fiber of the moldy thatch covering the little privies that cluster like swallows' nests on the walls of this old saffron-colored bulk. Seldom does a breath of life stir along the fretted balconies, or wander along rose marble garden paths within the walls. Once, coveys of maidens, lovely and blithe as syringes branches, bathe in the tanks, which are now... I ain't reading this shit. The story bores me. Story bores the fuck out of me. The woman who knocks at the doors. I want like a 2-page story here. Stories are all rather long. Oh, shit. Oh. That's all, bruv.